So tonight, I think we have a talk about an area of history that perhaps isn't particularly well studied or well known for a lot of us. Maybe people in this room know quite a bit about it, but I know for a fact, for example, that I was talking to a teacher who's present here tonight earlier, saying it's not even in the curriculum now for most history lessons at school. So it's kind of a part of our history that is really important to who we are and what Britain is and became and what America is and became, but sort of gets overlooked. So for that reason, I'm really happy to have such an eminent historian here to talk to us tonight. Carla Pestana is a distinguished professor at UCLA. She happens to be in the UK because she's researching a new book that she'll be writing later on. She's currently based in London and spending a lot of time at the National Maritime Museum and the British Museum and various other places, I think. So Carla is an expert on the kind of the English Atlantic world, particularly focusing on the 17th century, and tonight's territory is the 16th century. And she tells me the new work she's researching currently is a history of the Caribbean in the early period, but taking the sea seriously, focusing on the role of the sea and how that dictated and helped shape the way the Caribbean world, the English Caribbean world, evolved. So you don't need to hear any more from me. Please give a warm welcome to Carla Pestana.
Thank you, Joe, and thanks to everyone for coming out. Before I begin, I have a confession. I have been giving a number of talks since I came to stay in London, and I have developed a little bit of a relationship with my local printer because I go there with a disc or a stick and they print my talks. And I thought that I was very confident about British paper sizes, but I messed up. So I have this oversized paper, which if you see me like flailing around up here, it's just because I'm trying to find where I am. I know I could have had it reprinted, but in addition to being too confident about paper sizes, I'm also a bit of an environmentalist. So I just let him give it to me, even though I was like, wait, why is it so big? He said, you said A4. I was like, oh, I guess that wasn't what I meant. So in addition to my talk, I made you some copies of my pamphlets that are the center of my talk. So it's not that light in here, but if you want to look at them, I have the text. Neither of them are very long, and I've made a few copies that can be passed around. So sorry to the online audience, but I'll step away for a second. So they're a bit enormous, as you'll see. Anyway, so that's my confession. Now I'll begin. So I'm going to talk about Oliver Cromwell, but what I really want to talk about is this understanding, these military fantasies about conquest, or these fantasies about military conquest that shaped this moment that I'm looking at. And in order to make this, to focus our thinking about this, I wanted to begin by talking about two news reports that came out on London presses in April of 1655. Now, I don't know if you know about this period, but in London there were suddenly, over the 40s and 50s, an enormous number of printers who made brief quarto, 8-page pamphlets that published all kinds of news. They published, something that looked like a news weekly that would come out that would be, the news from Scotland, and then there'd be a couple paragraphs, and then it'd be, something that happened in the Netherlands. And so this was a relatively new development in English history, that people on the street could spend a few pennies and buy the news. And there were laws regulating it, but they weren't being enforced. So at one point, I read every single newspaper that it was published, skimming it for references to the Americas for a previous book that I wrote. And at one point, there were like 12 or 13 of them that were being published at the same time, different days of the week, different angles. So in this context, two news reports came out. Now, they were not in newspapers, which might be significant. They were two anonymous tracts that appeared on London presses a week apart. One, a great and wonderful victory obtained by the English forces under the command of General Penn and General Venables against the French and others in the West Indies. Goes on from there. Or 3 great and bloody fights between the English and the French, the first by Gen Penn and Gen Venables against Monsieur de Ponce, governor of St. Christopher, for the King of France. And if you know the Caribbean today, St. Christopher is what you now know of as St. Kitts, but was originally and for many years St. Christopher. The two accounts agreed on some points. A large English force led by General Venables and by what they called General at Sea, but was really Admiral William Penn, a French foe, a West Indies location, the rescue of English people held as slaves, and a great victory. So all those points appeared in both pamphlets. They diverged also. A great and wonderful victory described the French continent, in quotes, in the region where the French had many gold and silver mines and where some of those defeated by the English forces committed suicide to avoid being captured. 3 great and bloody fights had the battle on actual existing at the time French islands, mentioning Martinique, and the French portion of St. Christopher. And St. Christopher was at the time was for a long time divided between a French section and an English section, so they had that part right as well. And this 3 great and bloody said they gained land and slaves as opposed to gold mines. The latter, that is the great and bloody, was more hesitant. It had the victory on Martinique, and it had news that there was a threatened attack on St. Christopher. The other one declared triumph, and eager inhabitants willing to serve the English in gratitude for their liberation from their hated masters, the French. Both tracts gave optimistic and timely news about events of great interest. Although we don't know about circulation of 17th century print media, these presumably sold well, for reasons I'll talk about in a moment, or I hope I'll make clear in a moment. The 2 tracts, however, were almost entirely incorrect. Untrue, completely made up. Not completely made up, strike the completely, but largely made up. How they came to be and what they can tell us about 17th century English concerns is basically what I want to focus on today. So the tracts appeared, let me see, I'm forgetting about my PowerPoint, so let me see where I am now. Okay, nope. Here's a few quotes, although if you look at the passed around bits, you'll be able to see I focused on the English as vassals and slaves bit, and then the other part is kind of what they accomplished. I already mentioned this. But turning to actual news as the context for the Bogus reports, it's important to know that in December of the previous year, so 1654, late 1654, a great fleet going to an undisclosed location had left London. And the preparation for that fleet's departure and its departure was enormous news. It was in all the newspapers constantly. Speculation. They did things like talk about what kinds of supplies were being loaded on the ships, because maybe that would be some indication of where they were going. The news was not only in London. I found signs of it elsewhere in England and elsewhere in Europe. People worried about what was going on here, what did this mean? It came at a moment, Oliver Cromwell was Lord Protector. He had backed the English out of the first what we call the First Anglo-Dutch War, out of a war with the Dutch, which the previous government had gotten them involved in, and which he did not approve of or agree with. He had previously not only been as successful as a general in the 2 civil wars, that eventually brought about the death of Charles I in the regicide of January 1648-49, and he had been successful in reconquering Ireland and in suppressing a royalist revolt in favor of Charles II in Scotland. So he was triumphant, always victorious, riding high on his new position, and he decided it was finally time to deal with something that had been bothering him and his compatriots for a long time, which is the situation in the West Indies. So he gathered this fleet, but they didn't tell people where it was going. And as I said, people speculated a lot. And after it left, there was rife speculation about what was going on, where it was headed. From the minute they sailed away, the news did not stop. They just kept talking about that. Since they left, the public eventually came to know that the fleet had gone to a Caribbean destination, and that had already been suspected. It was reportedly in Barbados, depicted here in a famous map from a little earlier than our moment, but not too much earlier. Actually published in 1657 for reasons related to the events that I'm going to talk about today, but drawn a little bit earlier. They were in Barbados, where they were recruiting more men and awaiting supplies that were going to be sent after them from England. And also they hoped gathering provisions. They realized once they got there that Caribbean islands that couldn't feed themselves were not really great places to show up unannounced to gather provisions, but that had been the scheme. So people knew by then, the reports had come in that by April they knew that they had been there since late January, and so they knew something was happening in the West Indies. But events were moving very slowly in the Caribbean, on the one hand, and news coming to England was always excruciatingly slow. It could be months before anything that happened on one side of the Atlantic was known to people on the other side of the Atlantic. For a different project, I traced news of the regicide through all the colonies that England had, and some places didn't hear about it for a year. So news is very slow, potentially, and so, if you're sitting in England keeping up a little drumbeat with your newspaper about what's going on in the Caribbean, but never actually hearing anything, the temptation to start spinning a tale might have been there. By early April, when the tracks appeared, the fleet had yet to assail any target. So they hadn't attacked anything in the first weeks of April. The London press had already been publishing vague but strongly worded assurances of great success. They were vague about what the success was, but they were very confident that success had happened. And before that, they had been declaring, before the fleet had even sailed, or just as it was sailing, they were declaring that Cromwell would again succeed militarily, as he always had done in the past. So these tracks, I think, have to be understood in that context. The eagerness, the slowness, the confidence about victory. Londoners wanted to know, indeed all of Western Europe wanted to know, and news purveyors wanted to inform them. These tracks, I think, also need to be understood in terms of prejudices and expectations about the Caribbean and about prospective enemies. The region as a place of enslavement, suffering, and great wealth is one context. This is an image documenting how the Spanish allegedly treated the native peoples when they first arrived there. The idea of Spanish cruelty toward the natives was much rehearsed by all the Europeans who were not Spanish, particularly if your country went to war with Spain, you published these images and called back to the very beginning days of Spanish invasion of the Americas and talked about cruelty to the Indians. Ironically, they used a writing by a Spanish monk who was trying to fight against the abuse of the natives, who gathered all the information he could about how out of line the conquistadors were, and got the monarch to change the policy. So the conditions didn't prevail in 1655 in the way that these images suggested, but English people thought this was a constant state of affairs in the Caribbean, that this kind of cruelty was being exacted. They also knew that slavery was practiced there, as it was in other places in the world at the time, and they knew that great wealth was being extracted from the Caribbean, or through the Caribbean at least, from, the best informed would know, silver mines in what is today Peru and what is today Mexico. So enormous wealth is coming out of the region and terrible cruelty is being exacted. So you can see how some of the themes in these pamphlets come from the first, understandings of what's going on there. It's also a place that most readers, and probably publishers as well, knew relatively little about. Hence, the French have gold mines, which was never actually factually accurate about the French in the Caribbean or anywhere in the Americas that I know of at any time, but there you go. And they also have massive settlements, according to the one pamphlet, which was also not true. But, so the vague geography is part of what's going on here. They know about Spanish silver, which in the very first years of the 16th century had been Spanish gold, but those gold mines were quickly tapped out, and it was silver that was really the source of wealth by this time. So the tropes of Spanish cruelty, English slavery, and grateful enslaved people happy to be rescued by the valiant English was a theme that ran all through not only these publications, but many publications at the time. And I actually saw military planning for this undertaking that assumed that every non-Spaniard, indigenous, or African person who was in any Spanish colony would come over to the side of the English if the English invaded. So the assumption was these people were so unhappy with their situation that they would become a fifth column supporting any invasion effort. So this was a widely held belief on the part of the English about what was going on in the region. The French are a little trickier to explain. As the revolutionary government of England was at odds with much of Europe, it was a bit of a take your pick, who would be upset with us. They just had a war with the Dutch. They weren't very happy with the French for various reasons, including that some of the royal family, or by their lights, the former royal family, was being sheltered there. But then the Spanish were a persistent, potential problem as well, and also very pro-monarchy and not likely to support the revolutionary government in England. By favoring the French as the target, the tracts chose a rising power that might offer aid to Charles Stuart. It was known to possibly be preparing to help him regain his throne, or gain his father's throne, and was already, as I mentioned, sheltering some of the royal family. So they weren't a totally unlikely target. And I found one odd document that was actually supposedly, and I'm not sure about its veracity, most people do accept it as true, a conversation among advisors to Cromwell about, should we do France? Should we do Spain? What are the pros and cons? So it is possible that that was under consideration at one point. In this context, news of victory against the French to liberate the enslaved, including English, indigenous, and African slaves, and to grab vast lands and immense wealth, made a certain sense in the way that people understood what was happening in the wider Caribbean region and in the Americas at this time. The reasons for the false reporting are a little trickier, I think. There's clearly the desire for news, and a wish to fulfill that desire. England and elsewhere was very impatient, as I mentioned. The lack of knowledge about how long information would take, the unexpected length of time it took the fleet itself to do anything, which was not the plan, and I can talk if people are interested about why it got stalled out, first in England and then in the Caribbean so completely for so long. But one question in my cynical 21st century mindset I have to ask myself was, were the writers knowingly lying? Did they realize this was false news that they were handing out? It's possible, but I don't think they're kind of the cynical Russian chat bot trying to influence the outcome of a US election. I think it's more possible that fragments of information and rumors were arriving, that they then spun into a coherent story that they didn't actually have the information for. Here's just some of the, as we go along, this is examples of pages of newspapers from the time and also bits of news that are coming in about the Western design, as they called it, and they called it the Western design, not because they were trying to make a cataloging category for future historians, but because it was secret. And they knew it had gone to the West somewhere, and so they called it the Western design for a while, and the name kind of stuck with scholars. News and rumors circulated through the Atlantic, coming back to England, and these could have been taken as fact. Ships would sail by an island and see something at a distance and speculate about what was going on there. And as the fleet is coming up from Barbados through the Leeward Islands, stopping at various places, conducting business toward their campaign, it's possible that ships that went by in these locations saw things that they then came home and reported. We do know later that victory in a battle, when it finally happened, was reported because a ship sailing by saw an English flag and believed it heralded a conquest that it had happened, when in fact one had not happened. So that is a possible, if there's a 35 or 40 ship fleet sailing around, imposing English will, people are not necessarily going to sail up to it and speak to it and find out what's going on with it. They might just look in at a harbor mouth and go on. And those kinds of rumors could then get spun into something larger. Everyone wanted to know, everyone was speculating, and some speculation may have gotten into the rumor mill and gained credence. It's interesting when you read news reports from the wider Atlantic world, people are so skeptical about news that comes in that sometimes news writers will actually say, and if you go to such and such a tavern or such and such a coffee house and speak to this ship's captain, he will confirm what I'm telling you. So they had like a firsthand, they claimed to have a firsthand account that you could go check yourself because of the way news traveled so unevenly, uncertainly, and, you know, it had to come in a ship. It couldn't come any other way. There was no speedier form of communication. It is, of course, possible they were simply lying to sell pamphlets. But I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not persuaded by that. Certainly when the truth was known, and I'll talk about that in a minute, the publishers never said another word. They just let it go by. Now, the pamphlet form made that easier because there was no next issue in which you might have printed a retraction, like a newspaper, a news weekly would have to do, or might be expected to do. Weekly newspapers might consider a retraction, although I found many cases in which they just announce events in this history that they then the next week reported entirely differently. And only one or two ever said, last week we said this, but now we know that, you know. But mostly they just barrel on like, here's some more news, you know, do with it what you will. A pamphlet didn't have a next edition, so there was no sort of obvious forum for correction. Perhaps that format was chosen deliberately, if I'm going to be very cynical, but I think, in fact, it was just a big, splashy headline, let's sell a lot of these little penny pamphlets, and, you know, this is the best format to do it. Don't bury it in these tight paragraphs of a lot of different pieces. If you look at what I pass around, they're less than 1,000 words. So, you know, they're not a lot of information in these little pamphlets. And here's some images I got that you could see how you might at a distance see something and think you knew what was happening. Okay, now we're going to talk about, if I can be so bold, what really happened. The actual events. While London hacks were announcing great victories against the French, English forces were sailing toward the Spanish island of Hispaniola. They had spent the intervening 3 months or more in Barbados and other English leeward islands, awaiting supplies, gathering men, and settling on a target. And Cromwell's instructions had said, basically, conquer Spanish America. I don't care how you get started. Find out the latest information on the ground when you get there. I leave it up to you. So they actually did have discussions with people about what would be the best place to start. Hispaniola is a large Spanish-held island. It had early on been an administrative center and fairly populous, but by the middle of the 17th century, it was woefully unpopulated compared to what it had been before or what it would be later, and not very much developed. In fact, in 1605, the governor had ordered all the people living in the hinterland to come in toward the major town of Santo Domingo and basically leave the rest of the island undefended, unpopulated. They hadn't entirely obeyed, but that gives you a sense of how much the population had dropped, that they decided the best way they could control it and defend it was if they just pushed it down into a much smaller sized area that they were in control of. From the English point of view, it was well located. As you can see it there, it's, of course, Cuba is the one closest to Florida, and this is an early map, so everything is not exactly, to scale or whatever. And then Hispaniola is the big one, lower than Cuba, between Jamaica on one side and Puerto Rico on the other. So it was in a good location for attacking the rest of Spanish America. It was big. It had a major city, which had been taken before, Santo Domingo, by Sir Francis Drake, and so it seemed like a propitious place to begin with. Over the coming weeks, after they finally landed on Hispaniola, their massive army would be shamefully repulsed. They were there about 3.5 weeks. They lost, if you talk to the defeated general, only 700 men. If you talk to anybody else, it was closer to 2,500. But in any case, they were ignobly defeated. The island was underdefended. It didn't have a very big population. The city itself of Santo Domingo didn't have very many people living in it. Its fortifications were not very good. But the English forces had various difficulties from the first. They couldn't land right next to the city on the day that they decided they were going to land, for reasons I'm happy to explain in greater detail, in part because they have to do with how the sea was behaving, which is currently one of my interests. But they were put further away and had to march toward the city with very little in terms of rations and with the it was during the dry season, and it was the Spanish who were there were befouling any wells they might have come across. So they didn't have access to water very quickly. They ate a lot of unripe fruit. They got hungrier and hungrier. They started having intestinal disorders. They became ill in the way that Europeans newly arrived in the Caribbean in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries often did. So they were not in good shape, and they got lost. They took directions from an Irishman living on the island who claimed to be a friend, but who actually was fully integrated into Spanish Santo Domingo as a fellow Catholic, and who led them astray and into an ambush. They had all kinds of problems. By the time they finally got in sight of Santo Domingo itself, they were completely demoralized. Many of them were sick. They fell into a couple ambushes. They were terrified by being opposed by African residents whom they had been told would support them when they arrived. And many of the African men who fought them actually came armed with long lances that were used in capturing the semi-feral cattle that roamed the island. And the English had been so long that the Spanish had time to bring in these hunters, basically from the hinterland, bring them in, and they were part of the defense of the city. So there were lots of reports by disgusted men from the Navy about the soldiers being stabbed in the back because they were running away. But these lances were, 8 feet long, so it wasn't like, something that it was easy to combat with what they had. Don't get me started on mid-17th century firearms being carried around a Caribbean island for 3 weeks before you try to shoot them either. So actual fighting killed a minority, is quite clear, but many more died of disease and hunger over the course of the time they were on the island. When they were finally evacuated by the Navy, a very disgusted Navy, they had lost most of their horses, some of which they had eaten, some of which they had abandoned. They lost armaments. Guns were, big guns had been landed as a last-ditch effort to have them succeed, and those were just completely abandoned. It was an embarrassing defeat. The number of men in the army is debated. It was probably about 7,500, which is huge, a huge force. This is the biggest force that the English have ever sent to the Americas. 35 ships, 7,500 men. It was enormous. The Spanish, in theory, should not have been able to stand against it. I have lots of explanations for why it didn't do better, other than the disease and the trouble with the landing that I've emphasized, which I'm happy to talk about more in the questions if people want to hear more about it. But in any case, once the news was actually known, it was an incredibly embarrassing defeat. 1 month, almost to the day of sighting Hispaniola, the diminished army landed on the much smaller island of Jamaica, and that it's the lower island of the big islands there. Below Cuba is the island of Jamaica. Much smaller and even less populated, with probably only a few thousand people, Jamaica was considered to be an easy proposition, but also an embarrassing outcome for how many men and how much money and effort had been put into this. The property itself, the island itself, was the last thing held by the Columbus family in the Caribbean. They had initially been granted the whole, region, and it was slowly whittled down over the years until the descendants of Christopher Columbus owned Jamaica only, and didn't do anything with it, didn't develop it at all. And I wouldn't say that's one reason why it was so easy to take, because it wasn't, as it turned out, easy to take, but that was one reason why it was an obvious place to go when they were completely demoralized and sick and just trying to find some place. They said they were afraid to go home to Cromwell, but they also didn't think that most of the men would survive trying to go home, so they decided to go on to Jamaica. In Jamaica, the army bobbled the takeover, allowing most residents to slip away to the mountainous interior. There, these residents either tried to sneak off the island to neighboring Cuba in small boats, and some of them were captured by the English long enough to be robbed and questioned and then sent on their way. Or these people who snuck away into the mountains, they mounted a guerrilla campaign that went on for the next 5 years against the army, and they were trying to take back the island. And that's a long and complicated history, but one thing that comes out of it is a maroon village or two of African-descended people living on their own in the mountains, separate from the Spanish, separate from the English, and having their own defense, their own foreign policy, et cetera. And that's an interesting thread woven through this whole story. When the army arrived in Jamaica, it was ill and hungry and demoralized. The Navy returned to England, save for a small squadron under Vice Admiral Goodson. Afraid for his own health and or the consequences when Penn presented his actions to the Lord Protector, General Venables hurried after him in one of the state's ships with his doctor in attendance, saying, that he would not have survived if he had stayed on Jamaica. Once they both arrived, an enraged Cromwell clapped them in the Tower. Oh, there's Jamaica. I should have had that one earlier. Cromwell clapped them in the Tower. Penn was quickly forgiven and released, and he would go on to have a naval career during the Restoration. One of the men who was able to make that transition into service to the Stuarts when they returned to the throne after 1660. Venables had an extended stay during which he wrote a long justification that offered a whiny and defensive explanation, and, from the point of view of the historian, a gold mine of information. I'm so grateful that he was in the Tower trying to keep his head. He was eventually released. He retired from public service. He's never heard from again except for publishing a book about fishing. So, actually fairly famous, not the most famous 17th century book about fishing, but there's a 19th century or early 20th century version of his narrative, which is quite a thick tome, in which, thank goodness, C.H. Firth transcribed and published, and then his angling fishing tract. The remaining army and navy would not fully conquer Jamaica until 1660, at which time the new king would be the beneficiary of this acquisition. And we'll go back just for a second to look at Jamaica. I love this map because the list at the bottom, which you can't read, is lists of the major landowners. And I was able to go through and identify many of them, not all of them, but many of them as former army officers. One interesting thing about this is the army was not allowed to go home. They were refused transport on naval ships. They were supposed to stay. They were supposed to conquer Jamaica. And then the idea was they were supposed to settle it. So if any man had a wife and asked for her to be sent, she could be. Very few took them up on that. But eventually the land, when it was doled out to officers often, and sometimes to small groups of soldiers, joining together like 8 men from a particular regiment getting a tract of land. And I was able, even though the deeds in Jamaica are in very sad shape, I was able to find some of these land arrangements. But anyway, this is a good map for showing how Jamaica transitions into the Restoration era. Charles II had suggested that he would return Jamaica to Spain if it helped him to regain his throne. He either didn't mean it when he said it, or Spanish assistance was not sufficient, but he decided to keep Jamaica, as we know, and it slowly emerged as England's, by then Britain's, most valuable colony. At the time of the American Revolution, Jamaica was by far the most valuable colony held by Britain. It grew sugar and coffee, and it employed huge numbers of enslaved Africans. It also was a site for transshipping enslaved people for sale in other parts of the Atlantic world, including for a while, Jamaica had a contract to supply the Spanish Americas with slaves. Eventually, a valued addition to the empire, Jamaica at first appeared an embarrassing and costly failure. And here's valued. Here's its wealth on display in one of the big plantation houses that exists still in Jamaica today. In conclusion, fake news in the 17th century had a number of causes, I think. An eagerness to report in an environment in which good information was difficult to garner was the most obvious explanation. News in general, purveyed to the public in cheap print form, was new. Journalistic standards were a thing of the future, and unfortunately in my country, increasingly a thing of the past. Selling a paper or a pamphlet was more important in some cases than conveying the facts. Hiding the identity of the publisher of questionable facts in anonymous pamphlets provided some cover for duplicitous reporting, if that is indeed what this knowingly was. Cromwell's Western design was too interesting to everyone to be ignored by the purveyors of news, so I think some false reporting was perhaps unsurprising. Eventually, everyone learned the truth of the defeat and its great cost. And I think I put in the wrong place, but Cromwell eventually published this defense. First, he called for a day of fasting and humiliation when the news of Hispaniola came. But then he published this declaration of why there was war with Spain. And of course, there was war with Spain as a result of this. Justifying, listing all the things, all the instances of Spanish cruelty and mistreatment of English people in the Caribbean and of indigenous people since 1492. It was basically, the argument that he made that the English needed to do this because of that. Also, the Spanish were Catholic. Also, the Spanish were extracting great wealth from the colonies, which they were using to bolster their own power in Europe and to bolster the Roman Catholic Church. So for all those reasons, in Cromwell's mind, it was a very worthy target, which raised for him the question, why did it fail? God should have supported his effort. Cromwell shut down the press once news of Hispaniola arrived in England. As I said, there had been laws on the books that disallowed publishing all these news weeklies, but they hadn't been enforced. But he closed all the press and instituted censorship under that control of John Milton, the famous author, poet, But by then, everyone knew the truth of his humiliation. He tried to understand the message that God was sending him in this defeat. And some of the explanations that he came up with are quite interesting, including not that it was the wrong target, but that they had used unfit instruments. So while the men were dying of hunger and guerrilla attacks and diseases in Jamaica, the very first thing Cromwell's parliament did was order 1,000 Bibles to be taken by the first ship that went out to distribute among the troops to improve their moral tone and therefore get God to smile on them and bring them victory. He decided, he retired to his closet, his prayer closet, for a day and a night and emerged from it energetically in support of this project and determined to put it right. An interesting part of this larger story, his spiritual doubts are nonetheless a different matter than the fake news of 1651. And so I will leave them for another time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carla. Certainly a lot of history there I had very little idea of, so thank you. Any questions? Who'd like to be the first to ask a question? Thank you, over the far side here. Can you pass this down? Can I ask you, sir, to keep the microphone close to your lips for our online audience? Thank you.
Governments throughout the ages, and I'm sure Cromwell's was no different, occasionally go through periods where somebody says, can we have some good news, please? Do you think that there's any possibility that, you know, this was generated as a sort of leak from somebody, you know, within the administration, as it were, rather than it just being made up by a pamphleteer?
That is a really interesting idea. If it was a feint, then the tricky piece is the French, because I think most people knew it was the Spanish by then. There's a description of a man who's called in to, right now I can't think of why, but he's called in to meet with Cromwell, and he's in Cromwell's, basically his office, his working space, where there's tables and things laid out, and he sees a big new map of the Spanish Caribbean on the table. And he leaves this meeting, this is as the fleet is being prepared, he leaves this meeting thinking, oh, this is related, you know, why would Cromwell have this detailed map? And word of his suspicions actually get all the way to the Spanish. So the Spanish have actually sent out a couple of ships to warn the people in the Caribbean that there might be an attack in the offing. And I think the French is such an unlikely, unless the administration wants to somehow, you know, fool not only, you know, the population that there's been a victory, but also create some confusion about what they're up to. It's an interesting idea. I hadn't thought of that. Thank you for that.
Okay.
Thank you. You exploded the myth that the fleet sent to the West Indies was a fake story about the victories there, very conclusively. What about the other two that were mentioned? And particularly two great victories, 3 great victories, said the first pamphlet. And the third one was General Blake, who is a local for us. He's down from Bridgewater, just down the coast a little, so we have an interest in him. At Mallorca, was that true or not?
No, I tried to track down the other information in a less energetic fashion, since it wasn't as interesting to me, but I couldn't find any direct correlation to anything that had happened recently. So it was basically, and the other bits were very brief. you know, there were a couple of lines. So, yeah, I never did find what they were going on about. But having decided that they were unreliable witnesses, I might not have dug as deeply as I should have. That one pamphlet is the strangest of them because the person clearly knows nothing about the Caribbean. Like, they can't even come up with a name like Martinique or St. Christopher, which the other author at least could, you know, brandish about, which were some realistic, you know, names that were actually, the Spanish had no large settlements or gold mines or, you know, so I have no idea. I mean, the French had no large settlements or gold mines. I have no idea what they were going on about there. That's the more whole cloth, you know, one with the 3 victories and the gold mines and the French continent off the Caribbean islands. It's very odd.
Okay, we've got a couple of interesting questions from the online audience. This one's quite pertinent, I think, from Duncan. Thank you, Duncan. What was the circulation and readership range of all these pamphlets and newspapers?
You know, people have studied the mid-17th century news and tried to figure that out. The information is so scattered and uncertain that it's difficult to answer that question. The papers came out regularly and circulated, I believe, in London and sometimes through the post, but the actual numbers, I don't think we know. We only know about a lot of these pamphlets because of George Thomason, one of my heroes, who for some reason in 1640 decided big events are afoot and I should go around London and buy everything that's coming off of the press until things settle down, because that'll be interesting to have. And he ended up with a huge collection on which, God bless him, he wrote the date that he acquired it. So not only do we have all this ephemera that people would have read until it fell apart, but we also have dates that it appeared around this date. He didn't get everything on the day it appeared, but he got it pretty quickly. And the very upsetting thing for the historian is to read more deeply and find that after the Revolution, this was an embarrassing collection to own, and it almost was destroyed and ended up, thank goodness, in the hands of one of the later kings, one of the Georges, who gave it to the British Library. And the Thomason tracts are now a key source for people studying the 1640s and the 1650s. That gets us a little bit off of what was the circulation, but I will say that in addition to the print of these pamphlets, the print run, whatever it would have been, of these pamphlets, they were meant, especially these short ones, were meant to be read aloud in taverns. So the circulation of the information would have been much broader than just who could afford to buy them. So I'm sorry, but I don't have actual statistics about that.
I'll take one more from online, then we'll come back to the room. I think this question must be from someone who had a bad experience in Torremolinos, but were the Spanish actually more cruel than the other colonial powers, or was that just propaganda?
The Conquest period, when the Spanish arrive in the Caribbean and begin subduing, as they called it, the islands and enslaving many of the residents, were horrific. There were wars, they used war dogs, it was pretty bad, and they were also disrupting things so badly that they were causing starvation, and they brought all kinds of diseases. So there was massive death of the indigenous peoples in the areas that the Spanish touched initially. And when the conquistadors arrived fairly soon after Columbus and started trying to conquer areas of the Americas, the death and destruction carried on. So there was a lot of damage done. But Europeans who arrive in places in the Americas often fight wars and kill people. And so on a smaller scale, you can see terrible things being done in other places. The English, for instance, pour into the area that is the Massachusetts Bay Colony in such numbers that they start displacing the indigenous people there, even though there had been a smallpox epidemic and the numbers were much lower by the time they arrived than they had been 20 years before. And they fight a very brutal war with some native allies, as the Spanish had used in conquering what would become Mexico City. And they destroy the Pequots, enslave them or kill them, and declare that the Pequots no longer exist as a people, that the word can't be used, the name can't be used, they can't organize themselves into any kind. It doesn't take entirely in spite of the destruction, and there are now Pequot descendants who are organized and trying to, gain their rights. And so I would say comparatively, it's not an argument that really makes perfect sense. Interestingly, the Spanish have a form of enslaving people that is less terrible than some of the things the English are starting to do in places like Barbados. That is, some enslaved people in Spanish America have rights. They can marry. They can go to the church courts to have their marriages defended. So there are a certain civil area cut out for the enslaved in some Spanish colonies that it doesn't ever exist in, say, the English or British colonies. So I think it's more a matter of the English wanting to tell themselves stories about how they were terrible but will be better at this. And I think sometimes they believe it. I mean, William Penn, this is Penn Sr., who's the admiral, he finds a man in Barbados who wants to become a Christian and whose master will not allow any exposure to Christianity, which might involve literacy, which might be a problem for an enslaved person. And he intervenes on this person's behalf. So they do sometimes behave in a better fashion as a result of believing that they are better than the Spanish, even if they're not better than the Spanish.
Okay, we've got time for a couple more in the room, if anyone. Yep.
So just a quick question. Given that there was no objective published for the fleet, and that they actually managed to get a foothold in the Caribbean with something that ultimately proved to be very valuable, why didn't Cromwell then position this as a success?
I think it was a case of such grand expectations, such grand goals, that it was hard to bring it down to what they ended up with. Jamaica was small and poor compared to the other things they thought they might get. Plus, it was the end of the story. Like, they were not going to roll out of there and go, I mean, the Navy, which stays in Jamaica for a while, does attack some other Spanish cities, especially in the area that's today Colombia. They scoot down from Jamaica and sack Santa Marta and a few other places a number of times. But there's never any expectation that they're moving on to something else. So from his point of view, I think he thought, this was enormously expensive to launch. And they can't get together the materials that they need, which is one reason why the fleet is hung up in Barbados for a long time waiting for supplies. So I think the expectation was, we're going to do this and Spanish silver is going to flow into the treasury and solve all the problems of all these years of war and everything we're facing right now as a new protectorate, which was not the most popular form of government. in some circles. And I think he thought, instead of it being small, almost unheard of, and not valuable enough to pay the bills, I think he just thought, he had such high expectations. I mean, he had been triumphant for so long in his career. In a way, the logic of it always escaped me, which is he's staying in England. He's sending these people. There were problems with the way the men were recruited, which is why he ends up focusing on unfit instruments. I mean, basically, if you contact all the regimental leaders all over the country for the men who are still being held in arms in the early protectorate and say, send us some men, who are they going to send? Every single guy they wanted to get rid of was posted down to London to be put on these ships, So the idea that they're, and there were actually rumors among the men as they were waiting to sail that they were being sent to be enslaved in the Americas. One of my favorite regimental commanders, Francis Barrington, who unfortunately is shot when he approaches his encampment in Jamaica toward the end of the occupation by the sentry, and dies because, unfortunate for him, but also unfortunate for me because his letters were wonderful. But he shows up, and his men then believe that he reports to duty, and his men then believe they are not being sent into slavery, and they stop the uprising that they had planned because, so the reputation of the Caribbean is so bad, and the hodgepodge nature of the men that are gathered, or maybe they're also their low quality according to their former commanders, was the problem that Cromwell focused on, as opposed to the goals and et cetera, et cetera. Jamaica becomes a money pit. They sink a huge amount of money into it. And no one can believe it's a tropical environment. Why are they not able to eat there? Why are they not, it becomes a regimental duty very quickly to go and plant crops. Not popular. They expect to be able to forage through an enemy countryside and get, supplies that way, if nothing else. So the men are living off of rations and any cattle the semi-feral cattle they are able to slaughter. But at first, men go out to capture and kill these cattle and are either killed by them because they're so feral, or are found by the guerrillas and killed. And so the men are, basically being picked off when they try and go and to find food. But then they start getting malaria, they start getting, all these other cholera, all these other diseases. If the numbers of men who survive till the end of the Restoration are horrifying. It's like a third or less of them make it to the end. So.
Going back to the pamphlets, I was just interested in how the publishers were set up. Presumably they were making money out of selling the pamphlets, but presumably they also had to toe the line of the government at the time. So I'm thinking of William Playford just a couple of years earlier, who had to start publishing dance tunes and things,
right,
because he was tapped
right
on the shoulder and said, we don't want any royalist publicity here, my friend.
Right. Yeah, the news gets completely out of the hands of the government. The early on, the Parliament passes legislation to regulate the press. And there's a couple times when they contract, like who's allowed to publish and et cetera, but then it gradually inches out again and more people. Some of these publishers, they do weekly news twice a week under different names. People who study this can tell by the font and stuff, it's the same press, so they'll have, one thing coming out on Tuesday and another thing coming out on Friday. But there's a lot of news. Now, by the time of Cromwell, if you were publishing something that was openly royalist, they would come and close you down. But no one was doing that anymore. But other than that, there's no control over the press until, and it was so interesting to me as I'm plodding through these pamphlets, through these news weeklies, which I read one after another. This was so long ago, on a microfilm machine in the basement, cranking along, reading these terrible screens. And I realized, wait, they just are dropping off. Like suddenly they're gone. It took me a while to figure out, oh, this is when the news from the Western Design arrives. And like within 2 weeks, there's nothing. And then Milton picks a publisher, Marchmont Needham, and says, okay, you're now the official publisher of the news. And then he starts producing again, and a few others start being produced over time. But they hadn't been controlling it up to that point. I mean, obviously, there was a certain self-censorship, and if you were, nobody was openly articulating a royalist view anywhere in England without being, without them coming down on them by this time. So that was long gone. But in the 40s, you could find it. You could find newspapers that were in favor of the king. So, yeah, it's a fascinating source. And I am so grateful to George Thomason for running around London buying all those little handbills.
Okay, well, I think we better call it a wrap there. Or not, maybe one last question. Yeah, go on.
Thank you. Now, the English weren't alone in going to the West Indies. How did their experience compare with the Dutch and the French and the Scots?
That is a great question. The Scots don't go themselves until Darien at the end of the 17th century. The Scots go as prisoners of war during this period because they're taken off the battlefields and shipped as indentured servants, as prisoners of war. A not very popular policy, let me just say. And I actually found a great letter in which the governor of Barbados is explaining to Cromwell, yes, I know you sent me these spies, royalist soldiers, whatever, as indentured servants, and now you're mad that they're getting back home and causing trouble. But let me explain to you how indentured servitude works. Like, it's not limitless, and they will eventually run through their time, and then they'll be free to go. And he says, tell me, give me an order that I hold these men. In other words, that they can't become free according to the custom of the country for white, servitude. And then I can keep them here, but otherwise this is not a long-term solution to your problems. But as for the others, if we look back at this map of the Caribbean, I love this thing that'll go backwards. We don't have these where I work, I don't think. Or they don't give me one, I don't know. I have a pointer too, but I think that's probably a bridge too far. If you look at the eastern edge of the Caribbean over here, what the English call the Leeward Islands, that is where everybody who's not Spanish is until this moment. And a little sprinkling of people on this end of South America. The Spanish take the 4 big islands and then they pour into basically South and Central America, Mexico. And they hold it from 1492, early 1500s until this moment. And this is one reason why I think the English conquest of Jamaica is so important. I'll say another word about that in just a second. But in the meantime, there is a moment. Let me see, do I have a pointer? No, I have an off. Okay. Nope, that was even worse. Uh-oh, I entirely lost my place.
That's not Jamaica.
No. Uh-oh, where's Ollie? I think I messed this up. I can see it's down there. See, I'm not on the PowerPoint anymore. Okay, well, I will keep telling you what I should be telling you while he tries to figure out what I did wrong. At one point, the English, the point being 1629, the English plant a colony right off the coast of what is today Nicaragua, Providence Island. And they are in effect, the heart of the Spanish Caribbean. And the Spanish attack it 3 times and finally drive them off in 1640. So that's the end of going into the middle of the Spanish part of the Caribbean. Now, the edge, the outer edge, which the, ooh, good on you. The outer edge of the Caribbean, where those little islands are left by the Spanish to the indigenous peoples. They sail through them when they're arriving in the area, but they don't colonize them. They don't attempt to colonize them. And that is where everybody else goes. That is where the Dutch, the French, the English, eventually the Danes go when they get involved in actually planting colonies. The Dutch are around the corner from there in Curacao, but that's as deep as anybody goes. And there's a kind of unwritten agreement that if the non-Iberians will stay out here and leave everything else alone, the Spanish will stop attacking them. Initial colonization of some of those islands by various Europeans get a Spanish attack. But here's the thing, here's one reason why I think the sea itself is really an interesting part of this story. You don't get to the Leeward Islands from the Spanish Caribbean. You have to go up and around and come back from the outside because the current is so strong going that way that you can't do it. So it's the perfect place to hide from the Spanish. It also has attack the Spanish written all over it, of course, because you can go from there to the Spanish Caribbean very easily. But these little tiny islands that are trying to set up plantation economies are happy to have a deal. We won't bother you, you don't bother us. Barbados, which is the lowest island there, the kind of off to the side in the Leeward Islands, it is developed heavily with sugar and slaves by the time the English show up there with their big fleet in 1655. It's like 50-50 white and black with many enslaved people. And it is making enormous amounts of money. And the Barbadians want nothing to do with attacking Spanish America. They're like, we have all this wealth. We're sitting on their doorstep. We don't want, we don't want to get them to come down on us. So they hate the whole Western design thing. Even before Cromwell's naval ships start seizing people who are illegally trading with them. The Dutch are the big traders of the Caribbean. And they conduct a lot of the English trade as well as some of the Spanish trade and French trade, et cetera. And the English are trying to push them out with navigation acts. And the people who are over here are starting to make a fair amount of money and just want to be left out of it. Going to Jamaica matters, not only because it'll become the most valuable colony the English have by, say, 1750, but also because it is in the heart of the Spanish Caribbean. And what happens is, as soon as they get there, the French follow them and go to Tortuga and then eventually on to the unpopulated end of Hispaniola. And that's how you end up with Hispaniola split into a French island and a Spanish island. What is today Haiti. That is a follow-on effect of the Western design and the Spanish moving into the English moving into the middle of the Spanish Caribbean. The Spanish start finally signing treaties with these various other Europeans that basically say, you can keep what you have, but you can't take anything else. So they acknowledge in 1670 that the English have Jamaica and that that's just the way it's going to be and they're not going to do anything about it. They acknowledge in 1648 that the Dutch have Curaçao. So there's, and it's later when they acknowledge what the French have. But gradually the kind of nobody's allowed to be here message that they've been broadcasting since 1492 is muted a bit. So.
Okay, I'm afraid we do have to call a halt there so the staff can close up the building, but please join me in another round of applause for Carla. Thank you.